the project. And if you have, I'm just very happy to, get feedback if people can make time for that for now. I still have 2 more chapters to go. So, I mean, hopefully we'll be, out in the world maybe in a year or so. So we'll see. Okay, so let me just do a slideshow start. So here we are. Also, just so you know, my cat loves to be part of talks when I'm giving talks on Zoom. So you probably see him kind of going in and out. I hope this won't disturb you too much. It's kind of entertaining anyway. All right, so recent supremacism in democratic politics. I'm going to explain what I mean by recent supremacism and where I got this from. But just starting, right, so the starting point here for me, the people I'll be criticizing are, people like Habermas and Rawls. These are theory, and among others, I'm just mentioning these two, and mostly I'll be focusing on Habermas. Theorists of deliberative democracy who view rational argumentation as the main or perhaps even the only legitimate means for deliberation in democratic societies. And I'm describing this overall position as reasoned supremacism. And what I'm going to argue, relying on work that many people have done before me, I'll argue that focus on rational argumentation can have the exclusionary effects. It can create barriers for participation, especially for those at the margins of society. And this is, in a sense, it runs counter what we would hope rational argumentation would do for us. Why we would like rational argumentation to be something like a power equalizer, that what really matters is only the quality of the argument, not who proposes the argument. That would be great, except that in practice, that's very often not what ends up happening. And one of the ways in which marginalized groups, end up being excluded by this focus on rational argumentation is that, well, they basically there's this kind of catch-22 situation that they find themselves in. If they present rational arguments, they're ignored. People just don't listen. And if they make non-rational interventions in public debate, then they're criticized and sidelined for not presenting rational arguments. So basically, there's no way they can actually make themselves heard. And what I think, would be a good counterbalance to this, and I don't think it solves all the problems at all. So I'm not, saying, well, look, here's my panacea for, all the problems of, oppression and inequality in the world. Of course not. But I do think that pluralistic norms for political discourse that encompass different kinds of interventions, not only as rational arguments, I think this is something that at least mitigates to some extent these exclusionary effects. So let me just clarify what I mean by reasoned supremacism. This is a phrase that I'm borrowing from an Italian writer. So his actual name is Roberto Bui, but he writes under the pseudonym of Wu Ming One. So Wu Ming is a collective of Italian writers and intellectuals. They've been working together for decades by now. And so Wu Ming means anonymous in Chinese. And then they have numbers, right? So this Roberto Bui is Wu Ming One. And he wrote this book called, right, In Etera la Quo di Complotto. Apparently there's also, I haven't read the book yet. Apparently there's also a French translation of this book. I don't know if there's an English one. And in an interview, he says the following. So he's very interested in what we call conspiracy theories, and in particular QAnon, right? So this group of this, let's call it this belief system. And in this interview, he says the following: very rarely do debunkers of conspiracy theories, acknowledge the kernels of truth that lie in the core of conspiracy fantasies. They use the term conspiracy fantasies for what we often refer to as conspiracy theories. So he continues, they simply see conspiracy fantasies as falsehoods and imagine that demonstrating or proving that those narratives are false will be enough to defeat them. I call this kind of attitude ratio supremacism, the belief in the supremacy of rationality at all times, no matter the issue and context. If you're rational enough, you will always win. Of course, it doesn't work like that. It never works like that. So I thought this was an interesting way, at least, to introduce the general idea. And in fact, the next chapter in the monograph will be on conspiratorial beliefs. And so I'll also be drawing a lot on the work of Wu Ming for this chapter. And of course, here I mean something a little bit different with reason supremacism. Right? So basically, I mean this idea that rational argumentation is the main, or perhaps even the only legitimate means for the liberation in democratic societies. So this is what I'm gonna do. First, I'm gonna start with a concrete example of a particular societal debate that took place in the Netherlands over the last 2 decades, maybe a decade and a half, on this particular folk character called Black Pete. I'll explain who that is in a bit. And so this is, I think, is an example of how very many different kinds of discursive intervention were needed for the debate to actually unfold in a productive way. So this will be my example throughout. So I'll start with a very concrete example. Then I'll talk a little bit about the Habermasian idea of public sphere, and in particular the Nancy Fraser critique of Habermasian public sphere. Then I'll talk a little bit about the idea that argumentation, rational argumentation, is autonomy affirming, and I think that's where my talk comes closest to the topic of ethics of argumentation, and then in the end I'll just articulate what I take to be the kind of more favorable account of norms for discursive practices in democratic societies, and that would be a pluralistic conception of political discourse. So by the way, I know I think I'm not going to be interrupted. I mean, at least, right? Originally, I think the plan is like this, but usually I prefer, if that's okay, to stop at the end of each section just to check if there are any clarificatory questions that people have. Is that okay? Just to see, is there something that's not clear? All right, so let me start with the Black Pete debates. So the character in Dutch is called Zwarte Piet. And here I'm going to read a paragraph by actually a Brazilian scholar who's based here in the Netherlands, Patricia Shore. And I think this passage describes very, very well what I think is really the gist of the whole problem. So just before a little bit of background, so Black Pete, so this is here, you see the picture. This is Sinterklaas, right? So that's St. Nicholas. And that's a huge, folk figure here in the Netherlands, much more important than Santa Claus, as in, the Christmas guy. And according to the tradition, to the story, Santa Claus comes from Spain every year in a steamboat, and he comes with his helpers, the Black Petes. And so this picture is a picture of the arrival of Santa Claus, and that's a national parade, right? There are many such arrivals in the country, but there's one that's the main one, and that one is on television, so it's a big deal. And here it's from a few years ago when they were still with the traditional Black Petes, with basically it's a blackface character, right? With very clear racialized features. So here's the passage. So Zwarte Piet is the Dutch caricature of the black, with characteristic black face paint, dressed in the attire of a colonial African domestic enslaved servant, with an afro wig, as well as pronounced red lips, golden earrings, and a burlap bag. Traditionally, Zwarte Piet speaks broken Dutch with a Surinamese accent. Suriname was a colony of the Netherlands. Zwarte Piet is a racialized representation shaped in the 19th century, still before the abolition of slavery in the Dutch colonies, when it was introduced to the Sinterklaas festivities in the Netherlands. And these festivities are a much older tradition dating back to the Middle Ages. Right? So then there was a whole tradition in place already, but then specifically in the 19th century, there was this introduction of this new figure, Black Pete. So Black Pete, when I first moved to the Netherlands, I was shocked, right? It's just when you don't grow up with that and you see that and you think, what are they thinking, right? And I think that's That's the reaction of most non-Dutch people who get to witness this phenomenon. But to my great surprise, for many, many years, it seemed like everybody thought it was completely fine, with very, very few exceptions, right? And this is the time when my kids were very young, and I felt really, I was really in a kind of dilemma, because on the one hand, I thought, how can I expose them to this form of institutionalized racism? On the other hand, I felt, well, if I boycott this is gonna be something that's really gonna, stand in the way for them to develop as, Dutch kids in the Netherlands. And it was very surprising. So everybody just seemed to think that it was perfectly fine. And this went on for a long time, even though there were already, if you look historically, there were already, since at least the 60s or before, there were expressions of critique, right? There were critiques to the figure of Black Pete, for example, in letters to newspapers, or right in certain venues like that. But by and large, this critique was ignored, right? And the general issue, right? Because you might say, why make such a big deal over just like a character in a child's festivity? But of course, it's very kind of telling, right? It represents, it's like so, infused with this symbolism of this, the colonial past of the Netherlands. And this is really the problem. The problem is the lack of recognition for the Dutch colonial past and the role of the Netherlands in the transatlantic slavery trade. And also, on top of this historical ignorance, there's also the persistence, but also invisibility of these colonial power relations in Dutch society. Anyway, so then there was, as I said, there was already criticism, but it was very, really the opinion of a minority, and by and large, Dutch society didn't really pay attention. And then something happened in November 2011. And this was at the National Parade at the arrival of Black Pete. A group of peaceful protesters showed up wearing a T-shirt which had, as the slogan, "Black Pete is racism." And so in particular, these two fellows here, Quince Vigario and Jerry Afriya, sorry, and they were arrested. They were detained and arrested, despite the fact that they were just there wearing their T-shirts, right? So this caused quite a lot of upheaval, right? So all of a sudden it then became a topic of conversation in public debates. And so this really sparked the critical, the societal debate on the issue. But still, it was a very much of a minority position. Already before that, but then groups of activist groups became more and more vocal and more prominent. One of them was called Kick Out Zwarte Piet. But also there was a lot of backlash, right? A lot of counter protests, and a lot of people saying, "Stay away from our tradition. If you don't like it, move, go away, leave our country," that kind of stuff. And here I have this picture. It's really shocking. There was in 2017, the parade, national parade, was going to be somewhere in Friesland, which is in the north of the country. And there were going to be protesters against the racialized Zwarte Piet figure, who had been issued a permit to protest, right? So they were in buses going to this particular place. And then what happened is that counter protesters, they blocked the highway. They literally just blocked the whole highway, so that the protesters could not reach the place of the festivities. So this was it's really huge, right? And somehow they kind of got away with it at first. Afterwards, they were prosecuted, and they were charged with disturbing order or whatever. But so just to say, there was a lot of we really became a very kind of lively and very hostile public debate. At the same time, internationally, there was more and more criticism, and there was in particular critical reports by the Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent, that the working group associated with the United Nations in 2013, also very vocally criticizing the tradition and pointing out the racist implications, both origins and implications. So, right, so this was a very big mess, as it were. But the interesting thing is that little by little, there was a real change in public opinion, right? It started, so if you see here, I have data for, 10 years of just, polls, opinion polls that were conducted. In 2013, only 5% of the people who responded to the polls were in favor of modifications to the original racialized character, and 89% said, no, we're not in favor at all. And then you just see very, slowly but surely, every year there was something like, roughly 5% of increase of people who were in favor of modifications of the character. To the point that in 2023, right? So that at some point it kind of plateaued, but also because starting in 2020, by and large, the racialized figure started to disappear. And that means that this is at least my interpretation, because the question as it was posed was a little ambiguous, because by 2022, the original racialized figure had by and large disappeared. So in that case, a person could say, well, I'm not particularly in favor of modifications because the modifications had already taken place. So, but in any case, this data show that really over the years there was a slowly but surely process, the slow but sure process of people, public opinion changing very much. And what I found really fascinating was to see how people who had grown up in the Netherlands, who were white, and who had enjoyed the tradition and when they were kids, how they came to change their minds, right? So this was really, for me, was the most interesting aspect of, kind of the most interesting as as argumentation theorist. And here I have the example of this particular actress. Her name is Georgina Verbaan. And she, when she was young, she even played the Black Pete on TV, right? You see her here all the way to the right. And then at some point, then she became an activist, right? So here she's wearing a T-shirt that says "Black Pete is racism," and she says this is a tweet that she wrote where she says, "If I can change my mind, you can change your mind too." And she, one of the places where she explained her change of the changes in her views was in a TV show, in a talk show on TV. She said, well, I changed my mind. Well, first of all, I had lacked sufficient historical awareness to be able to understand, right, this colonial and colonial background, right, and how much the issue of slavery was really in the background. That was one reason for her to change her mind. So yeah, she says, right, becoming better informed of this historical background was very important. And another thing that she mentioned was that she came to realize how harmful the racialized depiction of Black Pete was to many people in the country, especially children of color, who, during the times of the festivities, they had to endure a lot of abuse at school. Many children of color then preferred to stay home, or even their parents kept them at home around, in the beginning of December, because it was just too distressing for them to go to school. And in my experience, a lot of white Dutch people who I know said that this was for them really very important. They hadn't really realized how negative the impact was on children of color. So all this to say, well, once things got going, the changes came very fast. I hadn't expected that things would change so fast. So by 2020, 9 out of 10 primary schools in the Netherlands had already excluded the racialized representations of Pete from their celebration. So that's huge, right? And as of now, right, looking at the celebrations of last year, the racialized Black Pete figure has almost completely disappeared. And instead, what we now have is what we call the suit Petes. Suit Petes, because the story, according to the story, the Petes, they go down the chimney to bring presents, and that's how they got, they get like their faces, with these patches of black. And so now this is what we have. We have suit Petes. And my overall claim here is that, at least in part, these changes represent a process of overcoming what Charles Mills has described as white ignorance, right? So there is a strong rational epistemic component in these processes, okay? So keep that in mind. So that's my, real life example here that will illustrate my philosophical analysis. So now let's talk about, theory. So, of course, everybody is familiar already with this idea of the public sphere as articulated by Habermas, but just to, bring it to mind. So here I have a description by Nancy Fraser, right, of what Habermas means by the notion of a public sphere. So, in Fraser's words, it designates a theater in modern societies in which political participation is enacted through the medium of talk. It is the space in which citizens deliberate about their common affairs, hence an institutionalized arena of discursive interaction. And while this passage here doesn't really convey the point that Habermas very much emphasizes on the rationality, right? So what he calls the unforced force of the better argument. So that component, but that's very much an integral part of his notion of the public sphere. And historically, Habermas identifies the formation of a bourgeois public sphere in the cafes and other semi-public spaces in early modern Europe in the 18th century, right, in the period of the Enlightenment. And the general assumption that's in the background of this idea of public sphere is that it allows for interlocutors to deliberate as if they were social equals, even if they're not. But the public sphere, right? So the principle, the underlying principle is that people participating in this public sphere, everybody has the same right to express their views, to defend their views, and also to criticize the views of others, right? The as-if point. And this is a very idealized picture. Many people have made this point before. And here I'm going to mention in particular the critique by Nancy Fraser, which is very well known also in this paper, 1990 paper, Rethinking the Public Sphere. So she points out that these cafes, these places where Habermas sees the emergence of the public sphere, were almost exclusively frequented by bourgeois men. So from the start, if this is really where the public sphere was born, it seems that women and working class men, et cetera, were already not, from the start, were not going to be part of the public sphere. And what Fraser points out is that proceeding as if social inequalities do not exist, when in fact they do exist, this ends up favoring the interests of dominant groups. This is very important for me. And what happens in this case is, right, these excluded groups are de facto, right, not part of the so-called dominant public sphere. And what they do is that they go on to form their own spheres of discourse, which Fraser uses the term subaltern counterpublics to describe them. And subaltern is a concept famously introduced by Gayatri Spivak, right? So this very famous paper, Can the Subaltern Speak? And Fraser draws very much on this idea to then conceptualize the idea of subaltern counterpublics. And these counterpublics, they offer spaces of withdrawal where marginalized groups can organize and mobilize and talk about, their situation and, and mobilize and think about ways, strategies perhaps to, express themselves in the public sphere and advocate for themselves. So, so the idea here is that, right, so while there is this, the starting point is the idea that rational argumentation, rational discourse can be a power equalizer. In the end, that's not really how it pans out. And one of the people who have made also this point, I think, in a very eloquent way is political theorist Iris Marion Young, who I'm going to talk about quite a bit towards the end of the talk. But here I'm already going to describe the ways in which she identifies these exclusionary effects of rational discourse of the public sphere understood in this way. So she speaks of external exclusion, and by this she means the many ways that individuals and groups that ought to be included are purposely or inadvertently left out of fore for discussion and decision making. Right? So they're like really pushed out of the conversation, literally into the margins of these networks. Then she speaks of internal exclusion in the following terms: having obtained a presence in the public, citizens sometimes find that those still more powerful in the process exercise, often unconsciously, a new form of exclusion. Others ignore or dismiss or patronize their statements and expressions. And finally, and this is not something that she conceptualizes explicitly, but I think follows quite naturally from this general, and other people have discussed this even inside the argumentation theory community. So the citizens who do not adopt the specific styles of expression that are viewed as more desirable, in particular rational argumentation, often end up having their contributions to political debate dismissed as being of the wrong kind, right? So even when they are included in these conversations, as it were, they are not being ignored, but they are, their interventions are seen as inadequate, right? As wrong, as flawed. And this is not something I'm going to talk about here, right? So, I mean, many of you have heard me talk about the model of epistemic exchange with 3 levels that I've been talking about for many years. But actually, these three levels of exclusion actually map on to the 3 tiers that I've been describing quite neatly. I'm not going to get into the details of that, but that's that's something I can talk about if people are interested. Okay, let's just if that's okay, let's just take a check if anyone has any clarificatory questions. If everybody's on board so far. I don't see any hands, so I guess I'll just proceed. Okay. All right, so now I'm going to turn to a topic that might seem like it's not really kind of fitting the flow of my argument, but I think actually it is a very important point to be addressed. And that's the point of our rational argumentation allegedly being autonomy affirming, because that's one of the reasons that, people who defend what I'm calling reason supremacism, they say, look, rational argumentation has this inherent superiority over other forms of discursive interventions in political spheres because it is autonomy affirming, right? Other means of communication, say propaganda, rhetoric, etc., they infringe on people's autonomy because they manipulate their emotions, or they trick them into believing things they don't want to believe, right? So there's this whole idea that everything that is not rational argumentation has this manipulative nature, which rational argumentation does not have, right? So this would be an argument why we should still stick to rational argumentation in the public sphere and the political sphere. And what I'm going to say here, again, drawing on work that other people have done before me, is that actually that's not really how it works, right? There's a sense in which argumentation, at least argumentation that is aimed specifically at persuasion, also has a coercive component. So, right. So this is the idea. Well, actually, I'm repeating what I already said, right? The alleged superiority of rational argumentation. That is this alleged respect for autonomy that comes with it, whereas other forms of discourse manipulate. So here's a summary of this general point, which is actually a paper on paternalism and rational argumentation, very interesting paper. George Tsai is the author, and he says the following, right? So he's describing the view that he then goes on to criticize. As a method of influencing another person's behavior, rational persuasion is often contrasted with coercion, manipulation, rhetoric, and deceit. As opposed to these, and I'm adding presumably generally morally problematic methods of influence, rational persuasion is seen as the morally desirable and admirable alternative, the one that shows respect for a person's agents. Right? So this would be what's good, what makes the rational argumentation so much better than other ways of engaging in political discourse. And just to be clear, right, so there's this idea of autonomy being agency and autonomy being respected. And that's the case in particular in terms of of epistemic autonomy, right? Autonomy in terms of one's beliefs and one's epistemic processes. And this has been described as a Cartesian notion of epistemic autonomy. We can also, it's very closely related to a Kantian notion of epistemic autonomy. Again, this is also something we can talk about, but here I think is a very nice summary by Sandy Goldberg of what this idea of Cartesian epistemic autonomy would amount to. An epistemically autonomous subject is one who judges and decides for herself, where her judgments and decisions are reached on the basis of reasons, right? Very important, which she has in her possession, where she appreciates the significance of these reasons, and where, if queried, she could articulate the bearing of her reasons on the judgment or decision in question. This is why, it's actually really essential even to the notion of epistemic autonomy, thus conceived, that reasons and rational argumentation be a focal point of people's not only epistemic but also political lives. So that's the view. And this view has been criticized, and I think very convincingly, at least by these two people, Robert Nozick, and more recently by John Casey. And I think they state something that, once it's stated, it seems to me it's really quite clear and obvious, but it's something that tends to be not to be recognized, right? So basically, rational argumentation aiming at persuasion, again, it's very important, this qualification. I'm not talking about rational argumentation in general, but at least our rational argumentation that has the goal of persuading somebody to change their beliefs or to adopt a certain belief. This kind of argumentation also has a coercive component. And here I'm just, this is going to be an argument by authority. I'm just going to defer to these two, philosophers who I think have made the point very convincingly. So Nozick says, well, the arguer's goal is not simply to point out connections among statements, but to compel belief in a particular one. And John Casey, more recently, has written a paper that I really like on argumentation and adversariality. He says the following: argument is adversarial to the extent that one arguer attempts to exercise control over the beliefs of another arguer, right? Exercise control being the key notion here. Beliefs can be significant parts of one's identity, and so altering them, even through rational argument, constitutes a significant intrusion on the autonomy of another person. I'm completely convinced by these points. So what I'm saying is not that we should never try to influence other people's beliefs. I'm not saying that. That would be impossible. We would all be kind of monads, right? And this would be like an extreme case of individualism. This is not the picture that I endorse, the picture of human sociality. Of course, so humans are social animals. It's really a cliche by now, but it's true. And that means that humans are constantly negotiating social boundaries, and they are constantly attempting to align interests and behaviors with others. So we are trying to change people's minds all the time, right? The point is that rational argumentation that aims at persuasion finds itself within a spectrum of different types of communication strategies, all of which will infringe on the receiver's autonomy to different degrees, insofar as they aim at control beliefs, control behaviors, etc., etc. So, right, so the point is that, well, in that sense, rational argumentation is not that different from other strategies of communication, the ones that are usually put on the manipulative side of the spectrum, like propaganda, rhetoric, etc. There's a sense in which, it's all part of the same phenomenon of people communicating with each other to, align interests, align beliefs, align behaviors, change people's minds, sometimes manipulate people to do things that, it's in the interest of the arguer and not in the interest of the receiver. So in that sense, it's all part of a very similar kind of phenomenon. And so, right, so Habermas speaks of the unforced force of the better argument. Well, the force of the better argument is also a way to yield power, right? It's still a way to try to compel someone to believe or do something that they might otherwise not have believed or done. And more importantly, they may not even want to believe or do particular things. So in that sense, it's, I think, autonomy infringing. So this is a way to kind of anticipate a potential objection to my critique of reason supremacy. And now finally, so I saw there were some people saying things in the chat. Should I? Well, yeah, but these are comments, so I don't think these are questions these are all substantive questions, right? So we'll leave it for that for later. So I'm just, unless if anyone has any clarificatory questions. For now, I'm going to move on to the final part of the talk, and then we can actually go and, debate and disagree with each other. So now I move to the positive proposal, right? So the idea that, what we can do about this situation is to adopt pluralistic norms for the political discourse. And here I'm really going to be very much leaning on Iris Marion Young. And in her book, the book that I mentioned before, Inclusion and Democracy, which is really a classic, has been very influential. And yet I think it, even though it has been very influential, I think it still has to be more influential than it has been, given how insightful it is. So here's Iris Marion Young, who I'm sure most of you know, has died much too young. And so one wonders what would have happened if she had stayed around for a little longer. So anyway, so the core, at least in my reconstruction, the core of what Young is saying in the book is that rational argumentation is not by itself a power equalizer, because power relations, they influence how arguments are propagated and received in a society, regardless of their quality. And that's really, in a nutshell, also the main thesis of the book that I'm currently writing. And that in the book, what I try to do is to unpack the mechanisms through which this happens. And so now again, going back to Young, she notes that processes of debate and decision-making often marginalize individuals and groups, right, in the ways that I was describing above, before. And norms of political discussion heavily focused on argumentation are biased against other forms of and styles of expression. And basically what ends up happening is that what I'm describing as reason supremacism ends up reinforcing the status quo. So-called rational modes of intervention are typically those mastered already by the more powerful groups and individuals in a society. So in view of this, Young promotes other forms also of communicative interventions as legitimate interventions in political discourse. She focuses in particular on what three modes of communication, which she describes as greetings, rhetoric, and narratives. And here I'm going to add a couple more ways, manners of communicative interventions in political discourse. I'm going to talk a little bit about nonviolent resistance, which is something that I'm personally very, a movement, an idea that I'm very interested in, and particular as instantiated by the civil rights movement in the United States. And then there's also protests, humor, and satire. I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about the three items here on my list that are in red. So I'm going to talk about rhetoric, narratives, and nonviolent resistance. So rhetoric, again, I'm following Young. She says rational speech consists of universalistic, dispassionate, culturally and stylistically neutral arguments that focus the mind on their evidence and logical connections, rather than move the heart or engage the imagination, right? So she says a lot of political theorists still have this kind of Platonic, subscribe to this Platonic dichotomy between reason and emotions, right? And then would side with the reason side of things. And she thinks that this, it's a mistake to then discard, right? So disqualify these kinds of interventions that move the heart or engage in the imagination in political discourse. And she's using the term rhetoric to cover this mode of communication. And she points out that rhetorical approaches recognize the situatedness and specificity of any communicative interaction. Of course, many of the people here in this presentation probably have also a background in rhetoric, right? So this is also one of the, let's say, strands of, research and argumentation theory. So, many people since Aristotle, of course, have not forgotten that you really need rhetoric also in politics, but various influential political theorists, they still have this kind of anti-rhetoric bias. And what Young points out is that they encourage, so this rhetorical approaches encourage us to construct our positions and messages in a way appropriate to the particular context and audience to which we are speaking. And here, what I want to, one of the ways in which, one of the kinds of manifestation that fall under this this idea, I think it's protest songs, right? So I'm very interested in protest songs. Here I have Sam Cooke, Change Is Gonna Come, which is still, I mean, it's 60 years old, and you listen to it, at least I still get goosebumps every time I listen to it. And so I think that's really, this has to be part of our, a broader understanding of political discourse. And so I'm offering, right, protest songs as something that could, exemplify what Young is describing here. There are other ways, of course, right? There are other, types of rhetorical interventions. Narratives, Young also talks about narratives, and here she, again, I'm quoting her, how can a group that suffers a particular harm or oppression move from a situation of total silencing and exclusion with respect to the suffering to its public expression? Storytelling is often an important bridge in such cases between the mute experience of being wronged and political arguments about justice. And here, so this is something also that others have written on, historians, also Elizabeth Anderson has written on the importance of narratives of like the lives of formerly enslaved people in the abolitionist movement. And a great example that I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but in my experience, people who have not grown up in North America and the United States often don't know about this example. So there's this a real story of this person called Henry Brown, who was an enslaved person in the south of the United States. And what he did is he mailed himself to Philadelphia. He mailed himself to freedom, right? So he put himself in a parcel, which got then mailed to Philadelphia. And there, of course, many people involved in the abolitionist movement were there waiting for him. So this is the resurrection of Harry Box Brown in Philadelphia. And the interesting thing is that after he became a free man, he went on to become a performer. And so he gave many theatrical performances of himself coming out of the box, right? And also, by the way, in England, he lived many years in England. And this is really, many people, in fact, critics describe this as abolitionist propaganda, right? So because he was just telling the story of his life. And so this, I think, is a great example of the power of narratives, in terms of how a group, an oppressed group can then make themselves heard about their oppression in public discourse. And finally, right, so I think it, obviously is within more or less the same universe, but then later the nonviolent resistance in the civil rights movement. And here the kinds of interventions are very, cover a lot of different actions. So boycotts, here of course there's the famous Montgomery bus boycott, which was the first kind of big success of the civil rights movement. Sit-ins, marches, right? So these are all, right, so it's forms of protest, but very specifically formulated within the spirit of nonviolent resistance. And this was very important. I mean, I guess most people agree that really it was fundamental for the success that the civil rights movement had. At the same time, of course, the civil rights movement also had to rely on legal and juridical tactics. And in those cases, of course, they were also dealing with rational argumentation. Right? So it's not that rational argumentation is no longer important. The idea is really, as I said, it's this pluralistic idea of public discourse where multiple kinds of interventions and types and strategies of communication are needed. So that's, I think it's a great example of this kind of, more pluralistic types of intervention in political debates. And now I'm going to just go back to where I started, the Black Pete. So the different types of discursive intervention that I just described were all involved in these public debates of the figure of Black Pete. So there were also rational arguments being exchanged, right? In particular, there was, historical analysis, and at least some of the process of overcoming white ignorance was really a very rational process in terms of people just coming to know things that they didn't know before and kind of putting things together. But there were also protests. Remember that I said the whole movement only really became visible in public debates once the protesters wearing the shirt where it said Black is racism were in fact detained in the 2011 National Parade. Also, another thing that played a role similar to the, in abolitionist movements were personal narratives. So a lot of people, for example, parents of children of color, who then even made videos of the abuse that their kids were receiving and posted them online, right, on Instagram or whatever. At the time, there was no TikTok. And I at least I know, I've heard this from white Dutch friends who said, I had no idea. I didn't realize that, this was really happening to this extent. So personal narratives played an important role, and also rhetoric in the form of slogans. So one of the main slogans for of the movement became what I have here on the picture, which says, a safe festivity for every child, right? Because what proponents of the Black Pete figure hadn't, at least some of them had not realized, and then once they came to realize, this really challenged their prior beliefs, was that actually the party was very exclusionary, right? The celebrations were not really meant for all children. And this is something that, people, you weigh the two things against each other. Okay, this is our culture, our historical tradition, which is important to us, but at the same time, it's also very important to us that every child gets to enjoy these festivities that are so important for children. And then I think this slogan really captures very nicely this idea. And then again, as I said, much Black backlash, it still exists, but in any case, there was, even to my surprise, a very quick change, and it took only it was a matter of 10 years for a very fundamental changes to take place. So to conclude, right, so a wide range of communicative interventions are required in politics. And again, I'm saying something that other people have said. I'm just articulating the argument in my own way. Rational argumentation for sure. I'm also not saying we should not engage in rational argumentation at all. No, I'm saying, well, rational argumentation definitely has its place, but alongside other communicative interventions such as narrative, rhetoric, protest, satire, and even propaganda. By the way, I didn't talk about, in the chapter, I also include a discussion of propaganda, but I've talked about this before and also have written on this before. So I thought for today, for reasons of time, I'm going to keep the topic of propaganda aside. But if people want to talk about it at Q&A, I'm very happy to talk about it. And one of my reasons to, make claim that, well, we really shouldn't, stick to reason supremacism is that one of the alleged reasons to prefer rational arguments, namely this idea that it's autonomy affirming, actually does not really stand up to scrutiny, right? There is also this coercive component to rational argumentation. And I also want to point out that this pluralism that I'm presenting, I think, is unnecessary, but it will not be a sufficient condition for a healthy democracy. Also, because all forms of communication, including rational argumentation, can come in good or bad variants, right? So what I'm saying here is no guarantee that everything's going to be fine, right? It's not meant as a panacea that solves everything. So one way to articulate what I'm trying to say here is that I think this form of pluralism is unnecessary, but it's not a sufficient condition for democracy to run smoothly. The examples that I relied on were mostly from anti-racism movements, right? So the anti-Black Pete race activism in the Netherlands and the civil rights movement in the United States. So this is a deliberate choice, right, to focus specifically on anti-racist movements. But I think the main point generalizes to other political stances and causes. For example, also to women's rights. The suffragist movement, I think, would also lend itself quite well for the kind of analysis I'm proposing here. But so just to say that what I'm saying here was focus specifically on anti-racism movements, but I think the overall point generalizes to other political causes, in particular other anti-oppression movements. And I'm going to close with words by Audre Lorde. When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid. So better to speak. Thank you.